Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure for FAO to host this working session in the 2021 WTO Public Forum. It's a session on fisheries, as you can see in the program. My name is Marcio de Souza. I'm a senior fishery officer in FAO. I'm also the secretary of the FAO Subcommittee on Fish Trade. And it's interesting to talk about fish in this trade house as WTO. Fish is indeed a very important international commodity. We always mention in the presentations from FAO that if we take into consideration the export value of fisheries and aquaculture products, that accounts for 56% of the world exports of animal proteins. So fish is more than poultry, beef, and pork combined. And this year, WTO Public Forum theme is about resilience, is about strengthening the multilateral system, and is about collective action towards sustainable trade. And what we did in this working session on fisheries, we tried to make it different. We didn't pick up any specific theme. We are going to deal with all the three teams together. That's our objective here. And we are going to have a really high-level panelists today with us. First, we are going to have two business people with sustainable practices from both the social and environmental angles, that they have incorporated that into their business routine, and will bring how the fisheries and aquaculture sectors is facing the COVID-19, the resilience of the industry, and the new opportunities that have popped up. In addition to that, it's also going to be quite interesting that both of those presenters from the business sector, they come from different angles of the fisheries sector that indeed represents quite well the industry, the small scale and artisanal fisheries. In addition to that, and later on, as the third presenter, we are going to have a presentation by a Brazilian diplomat who has been actively engaged in the fisheries subsidies negotiations and who also worked here in WTO in senior positions. And she's going to bring the view of how the negotiations on fisheries subsidies are reinforcing both the trade and the fisheries international regime. Finally, we are going to have a senior officer from New Zealand, from the Ministry of Primary Industries in New Zealand, who has also been engaged in many years in trade negotiations for New Zealand, including fisheries subsidies, and he will address the recent collective efforts, examples in the fisheries and aquaculture sector. So without further ado, because we have a very tight schedule to cover all those topics, I'm going to pose some questions to those panelists. And my first one is going to be to the private sector participants. So we are going to start it with Mrs. Citali Gomez. She's the CEO of Nemitura in Mexico. And then we are going to have the intervention of John Keeler, who is the founder and CEO of Blue Star Foods. And my question is basically in terms of the resilience and in terms of the COVID-19 crisis. So how, because fisheries and aquaculture products are very complex and long, they are quite complex and they have very long value chains. So how complex and long value chains like fisheries and aquaculture products can be resilient during crisis? What example did the industry implement during that time? And what are the future implications for that? So I will start with Citali. Please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much, Marcio, for the introduction. And thank you for the opportunity too. I don't know if you're watching my screen. Are you?
No, at the moment, no.
Just one sec. Here it is. I'm gonna start from a Precon. Do you see it already?
Yeah, just can you click in the presentation mode because we are seeing all these lines together.
Oh,
At the top bottom corner.
Where is it?
At the bottom, you have comments and you have 4 icons at the bottom of the page. Yeah, that one.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's a pre-competitive presentation. It's about our own, even though it's our own experience. We've been producing trout for more than 30 years and have been helping all the communities where we live. We're people from the city that implemented this organization. My mom and my grandfather began with this, and we are going to try to express the concern about how to get from the theory to practice through adaptation from aquaculture, because it's really difficult. Aquaculture and rural aquaculture in third world countries is like, it's interesting, it's great. If I would have to be born again, I would do it. But the thing is that I don't know how I can get the next slide. Here it is. Yeah, as I told you, this family rainbow trout farm was founded in 1991. Then we had second, third, and fourth facilities that we began to acquire and make synergies with the people. And we produce approx 100 tons per year. But climate change hasn't been very nice to the trout farmers in Mexico. We're a tropical country mostly. So we migrated. Well, we didn't migrate because we still have the trouts in a less density, but we also have bullfrog facilities. And this has been great because people in Mexico eat frogs as a cultural thing of capture, and this is aquaculture. So, and everything seemed like we had our life done and all our people's life like nice. It was like a fairy tale, but suddenly COVID began, and the challenges that we affronted was the people, because it's like history. Aquaculture is about people. The social importance of rural aquaculture is great. And we had like this problem of keeping our own business and keeping our people. Our production and the supplies, most of the supplies are imported. The ingredients of the fish feed, most of them are imported too. And we also import the eggs from all around the world. So, well, 3 countries. So it's like kind of difficult when suddenly the imports were blocked because of COVID. And then, well, we had like to face those challenges. And the market suddenly collapsed because most of our clients were all the food service. And the other challenge was to keep the operation and the costs under control and facing climate change, floods and forest fires. With COVID, there were a lot of forest fires well, as for you to know, we live in the center of Mexico in the forest, in the monarch butterfly region. But what did we do? Most of the people that are dedicated and committed to aquaculture and fisheries, we all have like this character of keep fighting all the time, and that makes us resilient. So we made a lot of strategic alliances and continuous analysis for implementing changes every minute, and migrated the market from the food service to retail, and then right now back to food service again. We opened more local and regional and national markets with B2B, with people we cared about, and we implemented these projects named Pesca con Futuro and other platforms in our country to lead the sustainable seafood movement, for opening markets for people like us that were having a hard time, but that have great products because we're into social and eco-labeling, not eco-labeling, well, we care about nature, and that's what we do. We also implemented with World Packers and other platforms tourism, mostly in Mexico, at least, and most of the countries where there is aquaculture and fisheries. It's really pretty. There's water, and most of the time there's forest. And if there's no forest, there's maybe a great, there are beaches, and it's really nice and catchy. So we have a lot of volunteers all around the country, all around the world now. And that's great because now they are helping us to be more resilient, and they are giving our people other classes of other languages, and they're teaching a lot of things. So we have these volunteers, local, well, national, and also from other countries, and developing skills for our team and our neighbor farmers. We made a community, we reinforced it even though we had it, and we migrate a little bit of technification with clean energy and, well, frequent renewal and adaptation practices. And the final thought is, most people say, okay, think local and act global, but we had to think global and local and act both. Back to basics, where we rethought everything. It's like, okay, what is about to growth? What is development really in a business? How much you earn, how much you grow, or only the well-being of us, of our family, and of all the people that we care about, and the people that have helped us get out of this pandemic and out of the climate change. I think COVID is going to pass through, but climate change is really affecting us, and monoculture, some practices, agricultural practices that are not very well, and deforestation is really bad in most of our countries. And producing and driving the markets into ecosystemic services also is good to storytelling and everything. Subsidies, other final thought that I think it is important is that subsidies are necessary and important to small businesses. We didn't have any because the government here hasn't implemented anything, but we're having a hard time, and no protection, no social protection or whatever. But well, I think it's important in small scale fisheries and aquaculture, and the risks that are related to all aquaculture and physical activities are huge. If any of the people that are listening have produced something, it's really difficult, but it's great. And diversifying activities related to aquaculture, that's great too, because it's not only what you do. We also bought some beehives, and we now have honey. And the ecosystemic services, as I said, related with the production are the key. And well, that's it. I put some other words here about what have we done and what we care about. And well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think it was very interesting that you brought this perspective that resilience and the changes that private companies can implement can be associated with the concern with the social protection, environmental protection, and all those basic concerns that are so important for the sector. Now we are going to move to the second speaker of the private sector, John Keeler. As I mentioned before, he's the founder and CEO of the Blue Star Foods. So again, John, the idea here is to explore how resilient the sector can be during crisis, what some examples that the industry has implemented, and what are the future implications. Please, John.
Good morning, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon. Hi, Marcio. Well, thank you for having me in here. And here's my presentation slides I want to share. Blue Star is a publicly traded company with base in the United States, but has a very vast operations in the small scale fisheries in Southeast Asia, and now also have a totally different paradigm or different kind of business that is a recirculatory aquaculture system called RAS on aquaculture in Canada. So I want to really show the two different worlds and how they collide together on the implications. The small scale and artisanal fisheries in Southeast Asia really is an activity with multiple stakeholders and tons of aggregators through a very vast informal economy. And they itself present very little to no help out of the governments. Predominantly is like, mostly they don't really get anything out of the government per se. And more so with COVID and setting aside COVID and put it into climate changes, they present tons of storms or more storms every year than anything else. So they are used to these shock and awe issues that exist in the in when it comes to crisis mode. I will say they live pretty much on a crisis mode. So how they go and adapt to any flow disruptions and bottlenecks in the supply chain, you really want to avoid that. And might as well, yeah, when you have some storms, they usually go back within, rebounds very quickly in a very resilient manner within 1 or 2 weeks. But COVID really, was the worldwide test that they had. So their lifetime test to do. And the issue that we see is that with by the time of COVID, they pretty much, their market dried out because most of the fish goes into they catch goes into exports, and the exports ends up in predominantly in food service, and the food service was shut down virtually. Their demand also dwindled, and it was a flow disruption, and they pretty much say, okay, what are we going to do? So they pretty much reassess themselves and find a way of reducing the efficient activity, because they just couldn't pay for the gas and ice and other auxiliaries. They went and did informal, and some of them already have a formal fishing cooperative, and they try to moderate all their needs through the cooperative by having a cash flow and financing programs within the cooperative, where the cooperative was putting some their funds at play, and or they were guaranteeing from the ice supplier or the bait supplier to the fishermen, or et cetera, and they were doing and the fishermen who get paid through the cooperative, and the cooperative was managing those alignments. And also they figured it out that, well, if we're going to have so many restrictions on where we're going to go, especially in the small and in countries that are tons of islands, they were actually doing a lot of sea trading. They were seeing themselves in a nearby spot at XYZ kilometers away from the coast, and they were trading the fish or the products right there, based on the ability to supply the local markets. They also went and put a lot of, in certain places, the local market was demanding more volume where other areas had the product, and that's where they were doing the trading. Now, that's a drawback, which is there were not much enumerators, or you couldn't really coordinate the IUU in that way. But moments of crisis like that, everything goes. So that's really, in my view, the most dynamic and resilient activity that I've seen when it comes to small scale fisheries. And the other spectrum on the land-based recirculatory aquaculture system is sort of really the exterior forces have very little impact. in what we do. Yes, there were some heat waves. There's the climate changes, but you got equipment that chill down the water. And also if there are storms coming, this and that, well, you have very suitable structures. And since when we recirculate 99.6% of the water, you pretty much can contain the issue at hand when it comes to any external environmental issues. Now, the pandemic-related supply chain disruption took a toll on recirculatory aquaculture system harvests. So what you do is you simply reduce the amount of feed you give to the fish to elongate their growing process, or the growing trend, and the growth, should I say? And but in these particular land-based systems, land-based or recirculatory aquaculture systems that we have are in first world nations like Canada. And the Canadian government really put tons of subsidies, and pretty much we're telling you, what do you have? What do you sell it for? We pay you, go and freeze it. So, that helps a great deal of it. So then let me go and tell you what are the future implications we have seen. And now I'm gonna put the two together, the two distant worlds together. Definitely strengthen supply chain to door future class crisis. And how they adapt, how we can get the sustainability livelihoods and the food security from their middle ground, so that you have to find a new balance where everybody have to be in line on different aggregators, and to minimize and that helps to minimize the food loss and waste, because most of the products that is in small scale fisheries perishable seafood. And how they work to meet the SDG targets, especially when they were trading in the sea to monitor and control the surveillance challenges. And then the food service have given them a reawakening that they need to go to other channels, and obviously was more the local, domestic, less export, and the retail channel. And the retail channels allow them to create a branding for themselves. It's no more a commodity. Some of the fish, have a good day. You come and enhance go and enhance the qualities of your products and your harvest and so forth. And pretty much today, I can tell you there's a transformation of a lot more retail presence on those two different distinct world on supply chain, but also the even food service today is having a tough time to get what they want, because the channel have shift, and I think that will stay there forever. So that's pretty much what I want to mention to you guys, and thank you very much for the opportunity that you've given to me, Marcia.
Thanks, John. Thanks for this. And it's amazing the two different words that you have presented, and it's interesting also to see the nuances between them, and even in terms of the number of suppliers that you have concerning small scale fishers and the aquaculture in Canada, and the government support measures towards overcome the problems and the challenges associated with the pandemic. Thank you for that.
Sure. If I can highlight, when it comes to the small scale fisheries, sometimes we have our footprint is up to 13,000 fishermen, 13,000, and then you have the opposite spectrum where you have a farm, closed caption farm.
Yeah, that's interesting, and and thank you for that. I think it was a very interesting presentation, and quite diverse realities that you brought, but that shows a lot in terms of the challenges, and in fact you can see some commonalities between them in terms of some root commonalities, let's call it that way. Now moving from the private sector, and I think it was quite interesting to show those the challenges and how the sector is overcoming. And now we are here today in this house that is devoted to trade rules, is devoted to trade regulation in general. And we have been attending several meetings in the past decade on fisheries subsidies, the negotiations on fisheries subsidies. We are not indeed going to talk about any proposal, any idea. The idea here is exactly to show how this debate helped the sector. And in this regard, we are going to have Thais, as I mentioned. She's a diplomat, a Brazilian diplomat, who has been engaged in this negotiation process in the past. And she's going to, and I'm going to again to pose some questions to her in terms of highlighting some specific aspects. So as I mentioned before, we are in the process of this negotiation of an agreement on fisheries subsidies. And what are the impacts of such an agreement on the sustainability of the sector? How can this possible WTO agreement on fisheries subsidies represent indeed a reinforcement of the multilateral system? So Thais, please.
Thank you, Marcio. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. First of all, thank FAO for inviting me here today. I think I will tackle that question from two different angles, Marcio, and you mentioned even at least one of them. One angle is the impact of a final result, the impact of an agreement. And the second angle is the impact of the past 20 years of negotiations on sustainability of the sector, regardless of the result. So I will start from the second angle because I believe it's not always the focus of discussions, and also because it will give us a very good idea of the potential impacts of an agreement on fisheries subsidies. So for the past 20 years of negotiations, we have had a lot of visibility and we have much more transparency. So nowadays, government officials, businesses, civil society, consumers have seen much more, have heard, have discussed much more about this issue than ever before. Fisheries subsidies was not so much in the radar of every single person on the earth that I would say that we almost get to that nowadays. So there is much greater awareness of the problems faced by the sector. And also awareness not only about the problems of some fisheries subsidies, but also the importance of some other fisheries subsidies, the green fisheries subsidies, and also some fisheries subsidies for very, very small scale fishing. So this issue has never been so present in multilateral discussions and in a very raised profile because they are making to the highest political levels, actually. It's not anymore a technical issue. There is no question today that there is a need for trade action against IUU, overfishing, overcapacity. And I can tell you, 16 years ago, when I first sat down at the table to talk about this, IUU was not at all something for trade negotiators. We would always say, what? What? No? So this is already a huge impact that these negotiations had for sustainability, in favor of sustainability. And I will also go ahead and say that in 2015, we have a landmark on this. When you have an SDG that talks about that, when you have a sustainable development goal, so the whole globe says, look, that's the direction we are going. And in the WTO, even if you have a very challenged Doha round, so there is not a consensus at all about Doha round, you have been having the mandate, the own fishery subsidies reaffirmed ministerial after ministerial. So of course, all this show a trend for the future. And trends, they steer business choices, trends steer policymakers' choices. It's a lighthouse effect. I will give some examples. from the government side, you have no bilateral or regional agreement nowadays that don't bring some kind of WTO plus rules on fishery subsidies, particularly the last ones. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is a huge mark on this. And many of those bring the texts that are on the table nowadays at the WTO. So there is a, you know, a mutual influence there. Also from the government side, you have policy reforms that are already going on. So I would just mention one, because we don't have so much time, I would mention the EU Common Fisheries Policy Reform. So where you have very traditional players already getting ready for the future, because as I said, every single sign is pointing for a more sustainable fisheries sector. So I would also say that there is a very important aspect of these reforms, particularly the EU one, because the regulations, some of those reforms are happening in very big markets. Those regulations are having global impact, because today, if you don't comply with the rules that the IUU, for example, regulations of the EU, it doesn't matter where you are, you cannot export to the EU. So you have huge global impact coming from big market regulations. There is also, again, and less from the government side, actions at the fisheries regime, but then I'll leave that for James. I know he will talk about that. So from the private sector, I would, well, first we heard our predecessors, there is a clear awareness of all that is going on regarding fishery services there, and they are getting ready as well for a more sustainable world, a more sustainable fishery sector. They are investing in sustainability. They are creating tools that help. The Google tool that allows you to know live where your fish is being fished is a very good example. And you have a proliferation of private standards on this. And those who get ready, they pressure the governments for more sustainable rules as well. And finally, you have the consumers. Consumers' choices have changed a lot thanks to this awareness. And they are more selective, and they demand for more sustainable products and more sustainable policies. So all this to say that while we, I mean, life doesn't stop while we are negotiating at the WTO. So things have been moving a lot throughout the 20 years, the past 20 years, even if for negotiators it's very frustrating not to see a result. But again, this is very pulverized, and it's not always transparent. It's not always clear which rule will apply to you as a producer, as an exporter, for example. If you have two markets, you may have to comply with two completely different regulations regarding fisheries sustainability, and that's not at all interesting for business neither. So that brings me to the first angle of your question, which is what's the impact of a multilateral agreement on fisheries. So I think it's clear to use a word of the sector. I think this agreement would anchor all that is what's going on in the sector, but consolidate all these movements towards more sustainability in a more transparent and predictable way. And then again, not only for the sector, for the multilateral rules as a whole, this agreement will be extremely, extremely important. And I will use to answer your question about what would be the impact, I would use the word synergy. Of course, that has been used so many ways in so many places that we even lose the meaning, but literally synergy means a cooperation that will produce a combined effect greater than the sum of the separate effects. And that's exactly what I believe in terms of the multilateral system, what's going to happen, I believe that the contribution that these two systems, these two regimes, the fish and trade, they can do to each other is extremely powerful. One will bring a very sophisticated and consolidated net of concepts, rules, best practices on the fish world, and the other brings the teeth, as we say, the possibility of trade sanctions for non-compliance. And not only that, but also a system of checks and balances that are very effective at the trade regime. I believe that that interaction, the synergy, it's a most needed step in the multilateral system, because most of the international regimes, they have been developing without communicating to each other. And there are many zones that where synergies could really amplify the effect of a multilateral trade, a multilateral rules system as a whole. So to close, I believe that my main messages here that I tried to give were that, one, as I said, the negotiations had already had a huge impact. And things don't stop moving while we negotiate. And as negotiations, they have been having a strong lighthouse effect on decisions that have been made by policy, by office, government officials and businesses. The second is that even if all this has been moving, we need a multilateral, coordinated and clear set of rules. Otherwise, it's the market, the biggest markets particularly, who are becoming the rules makers. And I'm not sure that's the best way globally we should go. I think I'll stop there. Thank you, Marcia.
Thanks, Thais. Thank you for this analysis. And I think it's interesting to realize that the first two speakers from the private sector, it was clear the complexity of the sector when they mentioned the challenges, the adaptation process, etc. And Thais just reinforced this complexity, but it was interesting to realize this aspect of a non-tangible value of the negotiation process. Because in fact, in FAO, we do have a program called, a project called the Hidden Harvest to map small-scale fisheries. And maybe we have also the hidden side of fishery subsidies negotiations, because there is an intangible value that has been already incorporated at the global level, putting, as you mentioned, the theme at a higher level policy, at a higher policy level for discussion and consolidation of, as you mentioned, IEU or something very restricted in the past, such as maximum sustainable yield and other concepts that now became like talking about a bound tariff for some trade negotiators is like talking about MSY or IEU fishing. And that's the beauty of also this process, that regardless of being lengthy, it has the advantage of putting this topic on board. So without further ado, I'm going to because Thais mentioned the importance of the collaboration between all of the partners, all of the stakeholders in this regard. And then I'm going to give the floor to James Brown, who is going to exactly talk about these collective actions between the countries in terms of to promote sustainability, to promote production and trade in the area of fisheries and aquaculture. So James, please, you have the floor.
Marcia, thank you so much. Collective action. I will share my screen. So Marcia, you gave me the task of talking about collective action. Now, when I think about the term collective action, makes me think of the concept of cooperation. So somebody who works on fisheries policy, fisheries management, fisheries trade, that's the phrase that comes to my mind. Because cooperation is so central to the work that we do and the way in which we approach all of these different aspects of fisheries. It's a given, almost, really. But you giving me this task to talk on this issue today, it forced me to stop and ask myself why. Why is it such a given, and why is it so relevant? And there are a few reasons for that, of course. And one of them is that the sector is highly globalized. It's a highly globalized sector, and in a number of ways. And you yourself, Marcio, you talked about the extent to which fish products are traded. They're the most highly traded food commodity in the world. Then on top of that, you've got the fact that people move, money moves, foreign investment and foreign crew, they play an important part in many parts of the sector around the world. But that's true of many sectors, agriculture, industrial sectors. What I think really sets the fishery sector apart in particular is the fact that the fish move and the boats move. So the very resource base that we're looking at here, and then the capital that's used to exploit that resource base, they're moving. They're moving between jurisdictions, they're moving between national jurisdictions and international waters. And in some places, they're moving between hemispheres, and they're moving between oceans as well. It's an extraordinary sector, the social, the technical, the legal, the political angles. It's a highly globalized sector. And that means that countries really have no choice but to cooperate with each other. If you're going to manage this resource in a sustainable manner, and if you're going to maximize your economic returns and your social benefits, you have no choice as a state, as a regulator, but to cooperate with other countries. And the other thing you did, Marcio, you forced me to again go back to basics a bit. And these this concept of cooperation, it's there in the legal instruments. These are reference points as lawyers, as managers, as technocrats, and so forth. And I went back and I looked at these are the three of the, not the only ones, but three of the key instruments: the Law of the Sea Convention, the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, and the Code of Conduct. Now, I'm not going to pretend this is a scientific exercise here, but I did a good old-fashioned text search for the word cooperation, and this is how many times it features in these instruments. 90 times in the Law of the Sea. Now, the Law of the Sea is about more than just fish, but nonetheless, it's there. It features so strongly in the Law of the Sea, and then in these more fisheries-specific instruments, you're seeing it there feature again and again and again. Cooperation is baked in to the way we manage fisheries. And this is not just about international fisheries, again, just to emphasize that. Go back to the Law of the Sea, the constitution of the oceans is often referred to. Cooperation is there in the management of your fisheries resources, both in your EEZ as well as on the high seas. So where those resources are shared, we should be cooperating. Now, I've talked a lot about the fish stocks, and all of this is true, fish stocks, but it doesn't stop at the fish stocks either. We need to be cooperating to be managing the wider impacts, environmental impacts of fishing. Seabirds is a real case in point, or at least it's an issue that's really a very live issue in New Zealand. There are a number of worryingly endangered, critically endangered seabirds, albatrosses and petrels nesting in New Zealand, for example. We're working hard to eradicate the pests, the cats, the rats, and so forth. And we've been successful at that, but their numbers are still declining. And this is because these birds roam far and wide, and they unfortunately are being captured by fishing vessels of many different jurisdictions. And so again, we need to cooperate. We do cooperate, states do cooperate, but we need to cooperate more fully in managing these environmental impacts of fishing. Combating IUU fishing is, Thais has touched on this, and this is another classic area we need to cooperate. IUU fishing exists for a whole number of reasons, but one of them is the ability for IUU operators, illegal operators, to exploit weaknesses in regulatory systems and to exploit this complex jurisdictional ecosystem, as it were, that we have. And so again, states need to come together to cooperate here. And then Thais has talked at length about subsidy reform. States need to cooperate on subsidy reform in any sector. And again, in this house and the WTO, we have very large texts on the issue on agriculture and industrial goods, and fisheries is even more so the case. Now, across all of these issues, fishing, environment, IUU, there are trade angles in many different forms across all of this. And this takes me to my next point, which and Thais and I didn't coordinate, but this was the point that Thais made about how I forget the phrase you used, Thais, about the connection between the two areas, between fisheries and trade. And we're seeing this, they're playing in each other's areas, or they're featuring in each other's regulatory areas in so many ways. And just to pick three real key examples, I think. One is in the work of regional fisheries management organizations. And that comes in a number of different forms. Catch documentation schemes are probably the most long-standing, certification from capture to market. The other one is you have in some RFMOs, you have more market state measures to regulate or ban the trade from countries which are not cooperating with those RFMOs. Few and far between, I should say, but nonetheless a measure that is utilized. And the other one is services commitments. And it's often not used, that term, in the RFMO context, but services in terms of port services, controlling port services for IUU operators, but also financial services. So insurance companies, banking services. These are some of a number of RFMOs are regulating in these areas to try and deal with IUU fishing. And then free trade agreements, as Thais made this point, we're seeing WTO plus commitments in respect to fishery sustainability, and Thais talked about subsidies, but also again in relation to combating IUU fishing and fisheries management. Now, the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement is really notable in this respect. It's very exhaustive on fisheries management. Now, that agreement has a particular context and particular history to it, but nonetheless, it's still I think noteworthy. It's also not alone. It's not unique, I should say. So CPTPP with its subsidy commitments and IUU commitments and fisheries management. And then we've got the USMCA, the NAFTA upgrade has a number of those commitments in there as well, and enhanced commitments, I should add. So, and there's going to be more of this. This is increasingly going to be seen in free trade agreements. And then the last point was on market state measures, which again Thais touched on. And I'll just elaborate a little bit on that. And this, we see here the European Union, the United States, they both have market measures, different, but working towards the same objective about trying to prevent the importation of IUU product. The US also has measures in place around comparability, around marine mammal bycatch, and shark finning as well, shark conservation. And so again, this is a growth area, and Japan has measures in development at the moment as well. Now, for better or for worse, these market state measures have driven change, positive change amongst a number of countries, it's fair to say. However, it's also, I think, fair to say that this is an area where there's room for actually more and better cooperation amongst the states that have these measures, cooperation amongst the states that don't have these measures. And that's so ideally we should be moving to improved, more fulsome coverage, so more countries have these things, but also to reduce the differences, the duplication, and the unnecessary barriers to trade that can flow from these sorts of measures, and so as not to make too many unnecessary problems for exporters. I wanted just to touch on some of the recent examples of cooperation, recent positive examples of cooperation. And again, of course, this is not an exhaustive list, but I think it's worth noting. Regional fisheries management organizations, so central to how states cooperate managing shared fisheries. And as with many institutions, they've struggled in the face of COVID. However, they have persisted in the face of COVID, even though people have not been able to meet face to face. They continue to meet, they continue to establish legally binding measures around the management of fisheries, and this is really significant. And of course, the WTO negotiations continue with great momentum, I should add. It's interesting to look at the G7's communique on climate and environment, and some quite exhaustive commentary there on oceans and on fisheries more specifically, covering a whole bunch of these issues that I'm talking about and many others as well. And this is encouraging. This is encouraging to see the major economies turning their minds individually and collectively to these issues, because while we do need multilateral solutions and broader cooperation, it's good to see the G7 coming together and making commitments in a number of these areas to try and make progress. And of course, last but certainly not least on my list is the FAO COFI 2021 Declaration for Sustainable Fisheries and Aquaculture. And so this was a declaration issued by ministers earlier this year, and this is the first multilateral ministerial fishery statement for many years. And so this is significant. This is significant in that respect alone. And then you go on to read the substance. Yeah, and the first thing it does is it reiterates ministers. They reiterate their commitment to the objectives of the code of conduct, and they reiterate their commitment to the effective implementation of binding and non-binding instruments. So that's the code of conduct, the law of the sea, and so forth. And then it goes on to frame the issues and the challenges of the day, and it does this through the lens of the code of conduct. And it's a very interesting and relevant read. I would really encourage people to look at for those whose minds are occupied by these kinds of these issues. And what it does is really, I think, it brings me on to my concluding points, really 2 points I think I'll leave people with, is that first of all, that the code of conduct remains relevant and the substance of that code. It continues to provide relevant guidance to states in particular about how to work individually and collectively to ensure fishery sustainability, which is pretty remarkable when this is an instrument from the mid-90s, 25 years ago, and it continues to be relevant. That's the first point I'd like to leave people with. And the second one is, it's a clear reminder that more work remains to be done. Now, this work isn't necessarily new. As I say, the code of conduct, it's very comprehensive. But that doesn't mean it's not valid. In fact, it means it's even more valid. So more work needs to be done. More work needs to be done on what states have already committed to do. And this, I would suggest, is going to need more and not less cooperation. Thanks, Marcio.
Thanks, David. Thanks, James. Thanks for this comprehensive overview of the sector, and I think it was quite interesting to. I think it was a nice at the end. It was a nice because we were a little bit worried when we set this working session in terms of the flow of the topics, but it was quite interesting to see that at the end we had some sort of continuity in terms of the topics, because we started exactly with the experience of the private sector. And we ended with the collective action. And I think the collective action, as you mentioned, James, is something that it's in the root of the fisheries sector, but that was also a major problem for the development of the trade angle of the fisheries sector, because we are used to products that are manufactured or produced in the geographical territory of a country. So New Zealand produced products in the cattle industry, in the milk industry, in the territory of New Zealand. But this approach of thinking of a collective action on trade that deals with a common good were something very new for the trade negotiators a while ago. And then goes back to what Thais mentioned about the importance of the topics and the importance of the fisheries topics merging into the trade regime. And I think James also mentioned an important aspect of the code of conduct for responsible fisheries. The FAO Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries was approved by member countries in FAO at the same year that the WTO was created. And it already talks about sustainability from the economic, from the environment, and for the social angle. It talks about certification. It talks about sanitary and phytosanitary measures. It talks about trade barriers, trade measures. So it was a quite innovative code for that time, as James mentioned, 25 years ago. So I think it's quite interesting to see that, of course, we all know that fisheries is a very complex sector. It's a very complex sector in terms of the nuances that Setali and John mentioned about the multiplicity of actors involved, small-scale producers involved with social challenges, with economic challenges, with disruptions in terms of logistics, in the supply chain as a whole caused by pandemic. And it's a sector that relies a lot in terms of export, of long distance trade. And it's a completely different sector if we compare with other animal proteins. We are not talking about 60 different species of cattle and pork and poultry. We are talking about thousands of species. So there is no single country that's self-sufficient in fisheries. They need to import to face the national demand for that. And that causes a lot of this complexity compared to other animal proteins. And that's the importance of cooperation for a shared good, cooperation for the sustainability, and cooperation that is in the, as James mentioned, in the center of the oldest regulations about fisheries, like the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, that puts cooperation between countries as a central pillar of the convention itself. So I think it's quite important. I was checking the board for questions. We didn't receive any questions, to be honest. I don't know if that flow was so complex for the attendees, but I hope that we have managed to send a positive message about the resilience of the sector, how the sector was able to meet the challenges, this non-direct value of the negotiations on fisheries subsidies in terms of upgrading all the topics of fisheries to a different level for governments, for the private sector, for the industry as a whole, and the importance of the collective action. We can only build a sustainable sector in terms of the social angle, the economic angle, and the sustainability angle with a collective action. That's fundamental. And that's fundamental, countries acting together to this end, but also the private sector being responsible in terms of the social angles, the sustainability angles, like the good examples that we have seen here. I think we have brought exactly business people that are very engaged in both the social and the environmental angle of production, which is quite important that we can go forward in this sector with a sustainability and focus on these sustainable development goals and reaching a better world in terms of production, trade, and sustainability. So thank you all for the presence. Thank you for the speakers. It was a very enriching presentations and discussion. I really appreciate on behalf of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And thank you all for the presence. Thank you for WTO for hosting the new edition of the Public Forum in this hybrid format. So thank you. Thank you all. Have a nice day, evening, and see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcio. Thank you, Marcio.
Marcio.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
You. Nice to meet you all. Bye.
Goodbye all.